recently research came out showing that levothyroxine can cause a loss of bone density. Can thyroid hormone replacement cause osteoporosis? I mean, without question, if you take too much thyroid hormone, that could cause decreased bone density, can cause osteopenia, osteoporosis. And I see that all the time with my hyperthyroid patients, where people with hyperthyroidism, too many people are taking thyroid hormone. And the problem is that that's all they're doing. So this episode is more for those with hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, as a lot of people with these conditions take thyroid hormone replacement. It's really difficult to conclude that it's related to the levothyroxine, because a lot of women, as well as some men, have decreased bone density even without taking thyroid hormone. So how do you know if you're taking too much thyroid hormone? Research does show that subclinical hyperthyroidism, which is when you have a depressed TSH and normal thyroid hormones, that can affect bone density in a negative way. I know, frustrating for those who are taking thyroid hormone, but in this study, it showed that even in participants whose thyroid stimulating hormone levels, whose TSH levels are within the normal range, that it was a risk factor. So how do you know if it is affecting you? And the only way to know. Hey, this is Dr. Eric. And in this Q&A episode, I am going to answer the question, can thyroid hormone replacement cause osteoporosis? So this episode is more for those with hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, as a lot of people with these conditions take thyroid hormone replacement. And recently some research came out showing that levothyroxine can cause a loss of bone density. And I dove into some of the past research studies, and the past research studies are mixed. I mean, there are some studies that also showed that taking levothyroxine can increase bone density, whereas others showed that it could actually, as long as you're not taking too much levothyroxine, too much thyroid hormone. Because, I mean, without question, if you take too much thyroid hormone, that can cause decreased bone density, can cause osteopenia, osteoporosis. And I see that all the time with my hyperthyroid patients, where people with hyperthyroidism, one of their big concerns, at least the people I work with, is the effects that the elevated thyroid hormone levels have on the heart. And that definitely is a concern. But another concern that a lot of people don't have is the effects that too much thyroid hormone has on the bone density. So how do you know if you're taking too much thyroid hormone? Well, if your TSH is undetectable, like less than 0.001, or some labs will be like less than 0.005, but that is an indication you're taking too much. Even if the thyroid hormones, even if T3, T4 look good, now they might be on the higher ends of the range, but if that TSH is depressed, research does show that subclinical hyperthyroidism, which is when you have a depressed TSH and normal thyroid hormones, that can affect bone density in a negative way. So that is one way to know that you're taking too much thyroid hormone. But in this study, it showed that even in participants whose thyroid stimulating hormone levels, whose TSH levels are within the normal range, that it was a risk factor. Now, it wasn't a huge study. It involved 81 people taking levothyroxine and then 364 people that weren't taking levothyroxine. And like I said, even in people with a normal TSH, there was a risk factor of having low bone density. And so, first of all, I guess, how do you know if it is affecting you? And the only way to know, really, I guess there's a few ways. One, you could do a bone density scan, DEXA test, for example. And I'm not a huge fan of scans in general, but everything's risk versus benefits, and you're not getting the same amount of radiation as you would be by getting a CT scan or an X-ray. So I do think that it's reasonable that if you've been taking, let's say, levothyroxine or any type of thyroid hormone replacement for at least a year, and if you haven't had a bone density test, to consider getting a bone density test. And if it's not covered by insurance, I don't think they're crazy expensive, but you might as well go to your doctor. And again, if you're taking thyroid hormone replacement, you could show him the research. You could bring this up as justification why you want a bone density scan. But the thing is, even if it shows osteopenia, osteoporosis, let's say, you can't necessarily say, I mean, it's really difficult to conclude that it's related to the levothyroxine, because a lot of women, as well as some men, have decreased bone density even without taking thyroid hormone. So in addition, so that still probably would be the first step, to get a DEXA test. And then there are some blood markers that you could look at and see if the bone loss is active, if you're actively losing bone. And you could do that right away too. But if you're trying to run it through insurance, the doctor might be willing to do a bone density scan, but not be willing to look at these other blood test markers. But it's not going to hurt to ask, and maybe you'll be able to get both done. But let's say first you get a bone density test, a DEXA test, let's say, and it shows whatever, osteopenia, osteoporosis. There are other markers you might want to look at. So there's serum CTX, which is C-telepeptide, and there's also one called P1NP, and this is P1NP is procollagen type 1 N-terminal propeptide. And pretty much they're gauging the activity level of the cells breaking down and building bones. So with the CTX test, that's measuring the amount of bone breaking down in the blood. So if you have a high CTX number value, then that's not a good thing. That means that your body is breaking down bone faster than it's building it. And then with the P1NP, you don't want to see that low. If it's low, then that's indicating a low rate of bone formation. And so if you have high CTX and or a low P1NP, and if you're taking any type of thyroid hormone replacement, that would indicate that you're currently losing bone. And then maybe one can make that connection more. Another marker that could be helpful is alkaline phosphatase. So most people, or at least most of my hyperthyroid patients, but when someone works with me, I'm always going to recommend what's called the comprehensive metabolic panel that looks at electrolytes, looks at kidney markers, looks at liver enzymes. And then there's a marker called alkaline phosphatase, which could relate to the liver, but usually, like if someone has hyperthyroidism and we see alkaline phosphatase elevated, that usually is related to increased turnover. And that's also an indication that they are losing bone. Now, you could do specific alkaline phosphatase related to the bone, and also there's a specific alkaline phosphatase marker related to the liver. But I almost always just recommend just alkaline phosphatase, because if I see that elevated in someone who has hyperthyroidism, I'm going to suspect that it's related to the bone turnover. And so if someone, like, let's say if you can't get those other tests, which you could also pay out of pocket if you absolutely had to, but you could also get a metabolic panel, which you get for like $20, $30 on your own if your doctor won't order it. But most doctors will order it because usually that test is pretty basic, covered by insurance. And if you see the alkaline phosphatase elevated and you're taking thyroid hormone replacement, again, that could be another sign that you're currently losing bone. And so what do you do if you're in that situation? If you're taking levothyroxine or, again, another type of thyroid hormone replacement, and you have decreased bone density on a DEXA scan, and then these other tests are out of range, suggesting that you're currently experiencing bone turnover. So a couple of things I want to mention. If you are looking to do everything you can to save your thyroid, in addition to watching my videos on YouTube, you also might want to subscribe to my free online newsletter, which is called Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid. Not only will you get the latest news on how to heal your gut and restore your thyroid health, but during each edition, I'll demonstrate a different blood or functional medicine test marker that relates to healing your gut and or your thyroid. There will also be an Ask Dr. Eric section where not only can you see questions that other people have asked related to gut and thyroid health, but you can also submit a question for me to answer in a future edition. To subscribe to the Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid newsletter, please visit savemythyroid.com/newsletter. So one, T3 can have positive effects on bone density. So we don't know because the studies haven't been done. The study that I mentioned was done with levothyroxine, and same thing with past studies, but would the results have been the same in someone who took both T4 and T3 or took desiccated thyroid that has T4, T3? And the answer is we don't know, but that's something to consider. And then, obviously we want to try to get to the cause of the problem. Now, addressing the cause of the problem doesn't mean that the person will not have to take thyroid hormone replacement any longer, but I think it's safe to say that a lot of people take thyroid hormone replacement and they don't have to take thyroid hormone replacement if they were to address the cause of the problem. And again, I'm not telling people to stop taking thyroid hormone replacement. That's not the point of this. The point is saying that in some people, by addressing the underlying cause, we could get them to the point where the body doesn't need thyroid hormone replacement, or maybe they need it, but not as high of a dose. And that's not just me saying this. I've had Dr. Eric Balkovich on the podcast, Dr. Alan Christensen. He also has that perspective where, again, there's a time and place for thyroid hormone replacement, but too many people are taking thyroid hormone. And the problem is that that's all they're doing. Well, a lot of people, like when you go to a conventional medical doctor or endocrinologist, all they're doing for someone with Hashimoto's, for example, is giving them thyroid hormone replacement, typically synthetic T4 like Synthroid, and that's all they do. And then they monitor the blood test maybe once or twice a year, and they adjust the dose, many times increasing it over the years, which again increases the risk of someone having lower bone density. So it is a little bit of a dilemma because you very well might need thyroid hormone right now, but you might want to consider working with a functional medicine practitioner who has prescribing rights, who can prescribe thyroid hormone, and maybe do a trial of T4 and T3 with the prescribing doctor, or desiccated thyroid. And then again, there's still that risk of the bone density still decreasing, but you could always do a future bone density test and see if it's having a positive effect taking the T3, either again by itself or as part of desiccated thyroid. And then also work with a functional medicine practitioner who will address the cause of the problem, which is not easy to do. My book, Hashimoto's Triggers, is quite comprehensive. It's over 500 pages just because there's a lot of different triggers. It's not easy. Sometimes it's not as bad, but sometimes it can be challenging to find, remove the triggers, heal the gut. But it's worth doing if that means that you might be able to get to the point where you don't need thyroid hormone in the future or need a lower dose. Then in my opinion, it's worth looking into this. And some might be listening to this and thinking, well, the thyroid hormone, I heard the thyroid gland is slow to regenerate. And so it would be difficult to get off of thyroid hormone. It is true that the thyroid gland regenerates a lot slower than other areas of the body, such as the gut, the liver, but it does regenerate. I mean, it might take years. I'm not saying someone will necessarily be able to get to the point where they don't need thyroid hormone in 3 months or 6 months or even a year. Again, some people might get to that point depending on how much they're taking. I mean, if you're taking a higher dose, let's say if you're taking levothyroxine, you're taking 125 micrograms compared to someone who's taking 50 micrograms, it usually is more difficult to get the person who's taking the higher dose of thyroid hormone to the point where they don't need it. But again, maybe that person, someone could get you to the point where if you're taking 125 micrograms, you could get to the point where you're taking only 75 micrograms, which is 50 micrograms less, and therefore potentially less impact on the bone. So just things to think about. It's again, just I know frustrating for those who are taking thyroid hormone and just wondering, is it decreasing bone density? And the only way to know, like I said, is to not only do a bone density scan, but do some or all the other tests I mentioned to see. So that is my answer to the question, can thyroid hormone replacement cause osteoporosis? The answer is definitely can, especially when you're taking too much thyroid hormone. But again, in this other study, which again was a smaller study, but still suggested that even when TSH was normal, that taking thyroid hormone replacement can have a negative effect on bone density. So as I mentioned, you might want to consider doing a bone density test, a bone density scan if you haven't done so already, as well as those other blood test markers I mentioned, and as well as perhaps working with a functional medicine practitioner who will do more than just say take levothyroxine for the rest of your life. And again, there's a time and place for that. If someone had a complete thyroidectomy, there's really no alternative that I know of other than taking thyroid hormone replacement. But for those who have an intact thyroid, it's something to consider. So as usual, I hope you found this Q&A episode to be super valuable, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.